think the task Rajiv Gandhi was given is to, in a sense, replace N.T. Rama Rao, who was the face of the Telugu Desam, this new party, with a puppet, their own person. And so we had no idea that that was going to unfold simultaneously. So we started with shooting the procession, and as you can see in the film, everything explodes, you know, the riot happens. Actually, people were very anxious to tell their stories about what had happened, because at that time there was Doordarshan that was shooting, they were not doing any of this stuff, it was only news. There was one BBC camera that came, I think, on the procession day. The police were shooting, and that was it, nobody else, right? So the isolation that they felt, 22 days of curfew. So I think it was almost a kind of relief that, and often they would say, koi nahi aaya, sunne ke liye koi nahi hai, kisko bataएं. A lot of places people would say, but why have you treated them in the same way? And I also used to answer that, no, you have to see the complexity and arguments of both sides. It's not, like if you see Owaisi's last speech, that whole last speech of his, where he talks about disenfranchisement and dispossession from an imagined sort of Nawabi history, past, that is important because logon ke zehn mein hai, that people, this is part of consciousness,
Thank you to the festival for this privilege of being able to have a short conversation with Deepa about the film. I've seen the film before, probably several times. But I think each time I see it, I like a little more. And this time, I was particularly, I'm not being sentimental, but I was particularly struck by the way the film has been shot. And I think some of you may know that Navroz Contractor, who shot the film, and who has been a very significant cinematographer in film in India. Some of you would remember that he shot Duvidha, which is one of my all-time favorite films. But he has also been both a partner to Deepa and a long-time collaborator and a very close collaborator with Deepa on this film. And it really is quite extraordinary the way in which documentary cinematography, which is continuously sort of changing, but how much a film like this, which this year was shot at least a significant part of it probably 40 years ago. So I think it's, for me, quite remarkable to just see the way in which the film is shot. And of course, the film as a whole, it's a little bit like, a chronicle of a future foretold, because so much of what we see in the film now has become familiar, but when you think of when these events happened and the optics of the way in which it unfolds, there's something quite, how should I say, it does shake you up to think that it's been the kind of the relentless way in which these things have been proceeding. So when you, some of you know that this is a film which had almost disappeared. And it wasn't until not so long ago that it was sort of recovered and restored, that we now have the privilege of seeing this beautifully restored digital version. And very often in connection with this film, you'll hear words like prophetic, in terms of. So I thought I'd begin by asking Deepa that what is that impulse that took her and Navroz to where this film begins, or the beginnings of this film? And, was it, there's something called, was it instinct? Was it, just a little bit about that process.
So just to share कि Hyderabad मेरा शहर है. It's my city. I grew up there. And for since the early 80s, I was also in touch with a lot of people who worked in the city, who worked in the old city. Some of them were academics, some of them were civil liberties people, some of them were political activists, some even party members. And whenever we would meet, there would be this, always this conversation would end up with somebody saying, "Kya hua is शहर को?" It had become almost a refrain. And in the early 80s, this same group, they called themselves Hyderabad Ekta. And I think were very concerned of what was happening in the old city. And they wanted to start some activities or some kind of way in which communities could sit together and really dispel these prejudices, biases. So they were working in the old city in any case. And I remember that on one occasion, I would always meet them when I went back to Hyderabad, a sense of what is happening. And then they talked about the Ganesh procession and what the Ganesh procession had done to the old city. And at that point, we felt, while talking to them, and they said, it was one of those things where they said, you should film this procession because we have to understand why are so many young men attracted to these kind of formations? Why do they go to these meetings? Why are they part of these groups? So the film began with that kind of very, if you like, it was a very modest premise that we would go and we would film once the procession started. And we had no idea that the larger political context of N.T. Rama Rao being so summarily dismissed, a new government coming in. Actually, that was Rajiv Gandhi's political baptism. He was sent to Hyderabad to do this because, just little background to understand that N.T. Rama Rao, by creating this new party that was talking about Telugu pride, was talking about and how, the way the Congress and other parties had not taken into account this, you can call it sort of Telugu ethnic nationalism, whatever you like. But this, I think the task Rajiv Gandhi was given is to, in a sense, replace N.T. Rama Rao, who was the face of the Telugu Desam, this new party, with a puppet, their own person. And so we had no idea that that was going to unfold simultaneously. So we started with shooting the procession, and as you can see in the film, everything explodes, the riot happens. And then after that, we decided just to stay in Hyderabad and keep going into the old city every day to understand, what was happening to people. So whether it was life under curfew, whether it was people who were attacked, their stories, and so we just kept going. I think for the entire 22 days, we would try and get into the old city and film. Yeah, that's how it started.
So I have a question which is of great interest to me, and I hope to some people here, which is that 40 years ago, what was the, I won't use the word inspiration, but to make a film like this, the form of it, where did it come to you from? Because I do remember that for myself, 40 years ago, we didn't have access to there was the universe of films that one could see. So how did the kind of very detailed forensic examination of a single event and then something constructed around it, how did you, in the filming of it, in the editing of it, what were you thinking, what were you making?
I think in the filming of it, it was just following the story, like the riot and what had happened post. But in the editing, actually, at that point, films that had been made on communal riots prior to our film, I have to say, there was film made on the Bhiwandi riots, Films Division and other places. And the way they were constructed was always as if two groups of people who would not even be named. You wouldn't even name, you would say some communities, or there was very euphemistic language. Suddenly, spontaneously decided to have, again, euphemism, clashes. Um, and that was it. But there would be no context, there'd be no analysis of what was behind that situation, who profited, what could have caused it. So I think in this film, it was very clear that we wanted to really, you used the word forensic, really, to do an autopsy of the riot. I mean, to use that as a investigative kind of way to set that up as the structure. But while we were shooting, as I said, it was just, following things. And in the edit, that's where this idea came about,
So, quite often in the context of documentary film, particularly documentary films that deal with very difficult moments like this, there is a sort of this word which is thrown around, which is of bearing witness. And sometimes it grants to the filmmaker a kind of, this larger than life role of, kind of reading into the material. But in this film, you see the emergence of the way in which the argument is kind of constructed out of your conversations with the people who are. So again, it connects to my earlier question of why did you feel, or how did you feel the need to, because it is a breakthrough of a kind, to actually talk to the people and see what are they making of that experience, and then, so do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I think, see, I have to say something. I mean, two things actually. You mentioned Navroz's cinematography. I just want to tell because many young people in the audience, this film was shot on 16 mm. And 16 mm, they were 10-minute reels. And, the limitation of that time and how you had to frame and shoot within that time and change magazines under very trying circumstances. So we were always, in the filming moment, we were on the back foot because it's like you're filming a public event, filming. So at that point, the framing and what's happening was really Navroz. It was all Navroz because very often, I mean, you've seen those sequences, like we were separated from each other. There was no way we could even, I could get to him sometimes because of the crowd or the people or whatever. But for example, one thing I felt when we did the interviews with victims or people who had been attacked, things like that. Now, it's very traumatic because you get there, say, within hours of the attack or sometimes within minutes of the attack. And so there is this moment where how do you film without being intrusive, without being voyeuristic, and yet I felt it was very important that these testimonies, if you like, or if you don't want to use that word, but and time and again, and what we would do in a sense is that Navroz always held back. So the camera in that sense was not sort of in their faces in that sense, and I would be much closer. And in each instance, I think it was not an interview, but it was a conversation that was quite long. What you see is a shorter clip, but and very often after the 1 or 2 rounds, I realized that actually people were very anxious to tell their stories about what had happened. Because at that time, there was Doordarshan that was shooting. They were not doing any of this stuff. It was only news. There was one BBC camera that came, I think, on the procession day. The police were shooting, and that was it. Nobody else, right? So the isolation that they felt, 22 days of curfew. So I think it was almost a kind of relief that, and often they would say, koi nahi aaya, sunne ke liye koi nahi hai, kisko bataएं. These were the kind of, so I think this way of people really speaking from their pain or their experience or whatever, it was them bearing witness to their own stories, not us. I mean, I think it's like that, really, you know. Yeah.
So, just to pull back a little bit to the first so first bit of our conversation, you know, you did refer to the fact that the earlier films on communal riots had kind of, you know, very anodyne way dealt with it, not mentioning who it is. In this film, we move much more ahead. We see them as results of, let's say, political machinations. But this story of the raising of a communal consciousness then moved to full-fledged communalism and now to a kind of full-fledged fascism. So today when you look back at the film and in terms of the politics it suggests, um, how would you reread what you are saying here? Like, would you know? Do you sometimes feel it's deficient that actually? I just because we have the opportunity.
I think there are two things, you know. One is that at the time, we were really looking at it in a sense of a Hyderabad story, okay? This is a very local mobilization, local Hindu militant mobilization. Plus you have the whole history of the city with the Razakars and the Majlis and really looking at it like that. And I think at that time, it's also about what one's reading of a situation is when you're filming, right? I mean, there's no way, like at that time, that one could have had these historical insights, though we were at, and if you look at the film, you see, you know, the language is the same. You see the saffron topis, the works. I mean, Ashok Singhal is there, VHP leader, he's on that platform. But at the time, I think in our consciousness, it was still a Hyderabad story, right? Though in the interviews with the two leaders, you get a sense of the basic plot and not for the future, but in the sense of how the polarization strategies are functioning on both sides, okay? But deficient in the sense, I don't think one could have thought of the grand, you know, what would happen in that unfolding, no, that would not have been there.
So, if we can just very briefly turn to the circulation of the film. So there's a lovely story I picked up in connection with the film about, because it was on a 16mm print, and that was all that was available then, that the print was run so many times that one reason for its disappearance was that the print was just, you know, ground to dust, you know, just called the ghis gaya tha. And it so happened that there was this print extant in Germany, and this recovery is from that. So, given that there wasn't a culture of screening people like Anand Patwardhan had been screening their own films, but this kind of campaign mode in which your interaction with Hyderabad Ekta and then these hundreds of screenings, do you want to talk a little bit about how it was received at that time?
It's very interesting how it was received at the time because what we did, some part of it was on prints, but then we actually got it onto VHS. And then the circulation was much larger. But within the old city, the way Hyderabad Ekta would use the film was very interesting because it would be almost like a way to trigger conversations, you know. And it was very hard in the beginning because people started saying, you know, how many bodies on this side, how many they were doing this kind of arithmetic. So it took a lot for the group, the Hyderabad Ekta group, to really break through that. But I think even though they would do that, I think just the impact of the interviews was something that they could not deny. You know, they could not turn that into another narrative, right? So it worked very well. What is very fascinating to me is after it was restored, so I'm talking about 4 years ago, I started having screenings of this film with young people in the old city. Went back to the old city and we started having screenings. And those conversations were fascinating because many of them had heard versions of these incidents narrativized in a particular way. And when they saw the film, it was very shocking for them because some senses it countered the narratives that had come down generation after generation, you know. And a lot of young people actually on both sides, you know, like I mean, Muslim young people would say कि पता ही नहीं था उनके साथ भी ये हुआ था, or on the other side, you know, because they'd only heard the attacks and the loss of life, livelihoods from their side. And then we could go into conversations about what's happening. But that was very interesting for me, that they could look at this history and also to understand the kind of generational trauma, you know, over years, what is passed down in families, which is not forgotten, you know.
So, you know, without blowing a trumpet on behalf of the documentary form and the independent documentary, I was at dinner with a friend yesterday, and I mentioned to him that there was this screening of your film, and he's a very well-informed journalist who has written about difficult things. But his first question was, what happened in Hyderabad in '84? You know, he had no idea. So I think it's important to recognize that in some ways, it's not just the documentary films are bearing witness to facts, or in your case, providing a very kind of very detailed account of the unfolding of a situation like this. But in some senses, they will remain as our only record, you know. I'm sure there is academic work, but you know, in terms of a public record of a time. So, I mean, for you, looking back at it, and in the particular moment that we are now, where, especially in the last 3 or 4 days, where all of us have come to realize that we have entered, in a sense, if this was the prophecy, well, the prophecy has been fulfilled. So I'm going to ask you to that difficult question that, as a filmmaker, as someone who's, you know, been an activist for a very long time as well, what do you wish this film had done? And yeah, I'm just going to put you on the spot.
What do I wish it had done then? I think it served its function then. I really think it did.
That's what I wanted to hear.
It is, because it's not just in Hyderabad, Purana Shahar or something, but it was widely circulated. I mean, I think, for example, in Banaras, in UP, Allahabad, people held screenings. It was, so I think for the time, thanks to VHS, the film really traveled. And I used to get sometimes reports about it. I don't know what else it could have done. I mean, you see in the film, like, if you see the structure of the film, there's a kind of weird equivalence, you know, between the two.
Yes.
Right?
Very noticeable kind of
equivalence.
Yeah.
And I think that also came from because of the intention of that our primary constituency would be Purana Shahar. Okay? And there, for example, it was very important that people watch it without, you know, both sides, that you watch it without doing a Michael Moore, you know. If we had done it in a Michael Moore-ish way, like sending them up, you already lose, because they were very powerful people in the old city. They had followers, they had cadres, you know. I don't know whether that equivalence is understood in that way, was understood in the way we intended, because a lot of places people would say, but why have you treated them in the same way? You know, and I also used to answer that, no, you have to see the complexity and arguments of both sides. It's not, like if you see Owaisi's last speech, that whole last speech of his, where he talks about disenfranchisement and dispossession from an imagined sort of Nawabi history, past, that is important because लोगों के ज़हन में है that people, this is part of consciousness, you know. So Yeah, I don't know. What else do you think it should have done?
No, no,
Could
no,
have
not
done?
at all. No, it's just that, whenever when you make a film and you see it after a long period of time, you know it was made at a certain moment, and, sometimes you had a set of goals. Over time, your own goals shift, your own artistic goals shift, your political goals shift. But I think it's quite remarkable. I think the films we remember are the films that have miraculously that staying power. I mean, we are going to be watching Ram Ke Naam in a day or two, and it's another film which somehow has that enduring power. So I think our time is up, and I'd just like all of you to give a round of applause to Deepa for our thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.